Damaged Defenders by Sherza. Chapter 109. Peter and Tony. Peter debated the wisdom of approaching the Avengers the day after they destroyed the castle in Bavaria. The news pundits were going nuts over the incident. The Daily Bugle, well, Jameson really, had promptly had a virtual, possibly literal, knowing Jameson's tendency towards histrionics, coronary, and was calling the Avengers all sorts of horrible things. They were, however, notable as being the only ones to still be doing so. All the TV reporters had all started out that way last night, to be sure. Some had started changing their tune the moment it became clear just how much firepower was defending the castle. Most of the less sensationalistic news reporters had started asking why in the world a random castle in Germany needed that kind of security and firepower. But the hysterics of all but the worst of the sensationalists had changed tune really fast the moment the blue energy guns had come out. Pretty much the entire planet knew Captain America's story, a story that included at least mentions of Red Skull and the weapons he'd developed to throw at Steve. Weapons that had not been seen since before World War II properly ended. Those weapons had disappeared into the ether within months of Steve going down in the ice, as had Hydra itself. It hadn't taken long for someone to start digging around to find out who owned, or had owned, the castle the Avengers were reducing to so much ash and dust. Within hours of the attack, the world in general was freaking out still. But now it was over the possibility that Hydra was still out there, because that random castle really wasn't. It belonged to the von Struckers, who had been notable as Hydra loyalists during the war. Given the security and firepower in the place and the fact the Avengers were destroying it, it hadn't taken long for the pundits to add 2 and 2 and get 4. By the time the actual newspapers came out this morning, they'd all, except the Bugle, been full of speculations about Hydra rather than attacking the Avengers. Peter figured the Avengers were either going to be grumpy or tired or worse, both. But he also figured they could probably use an excuse to think about something other than Hydra right about now. So after talking it over with Aunt May and her agreeing with Peter's line of thought, they headed to the tower. After, much to Peter's amusement, Aunt May grabbed the spices for one of her casseroles. Peter guessed that she figured the tower would have, or could quickly get, the other ingredients, but her secret spice mixes not so much. The secretary at the desk waved them on, clearly either recognizing them or having been warned by Jarvis. Once they were in the elevator, Peter spoke up. "Hey, Jarvis, where are Mr. Stark and Dr. Banner?" he asked. "Dr. Banner is currently still sleeping off yesterday's transformation," Jarvis told him. "I am unsure when he will rouse. Sir is in his lab tinkering with one of the suits." "Oh, that works. I've got my web-slingers with me. Think he would mind taking a look at them?" Peter asked, ducking his head a little at the look Aunt May gave him. "I am quite sure he will want to take a look," Jarvis said, and Peter swore he sounded amused. "Once you've dropped Peter off, drop me off on the common floor of the kitchen. I think everyone deserved a home-cooked meal after yesterday," Aunt May said, "and I seriously doubt most of them can cook." "Your assumption is correct. I have observed only Dr. Banner to have more than the most basic cooking ability," Jarvis said. "Everyone else either depends on deliveries, microwavable meals, or Mrs. Lewis's cooking efforts. Miss Lewis does seem to be quite competent, but she has only begun to cook for others in the last week." Aunt May tisked, meaning they've had most of a month of rather questionable eating. Peter managed not to start laughing until after the elevator doors closed behind him when he got off on the lab floor. The Avengers had no idea what they just let themselves in for. Aunt May was pretty darn fierce, and Peter absolutely would not put it past her to bully everyone into eating a positively huge home-cooked family meal. A meal that would probably put most Thanksgiving spreads to shame, since Aunt May would have access to all sorts of things and not have to worry about the expense of it. Jarvis had evidently warned Mr. Stark about Peter's arrival because when the lab door opened, the music was already down to a manageable level. Peter stopped dead about a foot inside the door, staring around the big lab. which, it had to be noted, didn't look much like a lab, but more like a garage or machine shop, which made sense given Mr. Stark's affinity for mechanical things. There were 3 suits along one wall, and an open space where a suit was missing. One of the 3 suits was visibly lighter than the other 2, so Peter presumed it was the now famous suitcase suit. The back wall was taken up with fabrication equipment of all descriptions, and a heavily armored area Peter figured was for testing things without running the risk of blowing up half the lab. The third wall was mostly shelving units with all sorts of tools and parts in bins, but there were also 3 spaces whose immediate purpose Peter couldn't guess at. The center of the room was taken up with a bunch of workbenches, wheeled stools, 3 mobile robot arms, and a good-sized empty area that was probably intended for tech too big, heavy, or awkward to set on the benches. All but one of the benches were covered in parts and tools. Peter could recognize enough of the parts that he realized each bench represented one specific in-progress piece of tech. Mr. Stark was currently mostly under the torso of a 4th suit, which was hanging suspended from the ceiling so he could get into the torso area. What exactly he was doing, Peter had no clue, as Mr. Stark's face, arms, and upper chest were all hidden from sight. The legs of the suit were currently laying on the only bench clear of any other project. "Hang on just a sec. Gotta reattach this sensor," Mr. Stark called. A moment later, he pulled out of the suit torso. Peter, despite the hero worship thing, was hard put on to laugh because Mr. Stark looked like he stuck his finger in a light socket. Of course, Peter couldn't talk too much. His own hair, while not quite as unruly as Mr. Stark's, it definitely had a life of its own sometimes. "So, Jarvis tells me you have tech you want me to look at," Mr. Stark said, then made grabby hands. "Something about you putting it together yourself?" "Yes, sir," Peter finally managed, and took off the web-slingers. Yes, he wore them everywhere. He was trying to figure out a workable way to wear the suit everywhere, too, to cut down on how long it took him to switch over. Mr. Stark gave him a wide-eyed look of horror and disgust. "Sir? What is this sir crap? Jarvis, did you corrupt this kid before we even met properly?" Before Jarvis could reply, he waved a hand. Never mind. He pointed at Peter. "It's Tony." Peter had kind of expected something of the sort. Dr. Banner had said to call him Bruce, after all, and Mr. Stark hardly seemed the type to stand on ceremony. Still, it was the kind of thing that made his not-so-secret inner geek spaz just a little. "Okay, Tony." That was going to be weird for a while. Tony finally took the web-slinger out of Peter's hand and rolled himself to the end of the bench with the suit legs on it where he had some room to work. "Dummy, give me my micro kit, would you? This is pretty small." There was a beep from one of the robots, and it rolled off to fetch the requested kit. Once it had deposited the kit on the bench by Tony's left elbow, it turned its attention to Peter. Peter watched it, somewhere between curious as all get out and a touch wary as it circled him, beeping and trilling in a way that reminded Peter a little of R2-D2 as it went. "Don't mind Dummy," Tony said as he opened the toolkit. "He's just curious. And a tad protective." Okay, probably more than a tad, Tony could admit, but it wasn't like Dummy didn't have reason to be. Tony paid no heed to Peter's response to that, if he even gave one, as Tony started working on the web-slingers. He got quite the surprise. Given that Peter was a teenager with all the lack of money, access to materials, and experience that implied, Tony had fully expected a hack job on the web-slingers. What he actually got was, yes, comprised of low quality and recycled materials, but it was also surprisingly well put together despite that. Enough so to make Tony curious about what Peter might be capable of making on his own with access to better materials. "Well," he said, "this is surprisingly unterrible. You, in fact, did a better job on this than S.H.I.E.L.D. R&D did on Martin's Quiver, which is kind of horrifying given what you had access to versus what they had access to." "Really?" The kid looked somewhere between absolutely thrilled and horrified. Tony nodded. "So," Tony said, "what I'm going to do here is give you carte blanche in here. I've got all the tools and materials you might need, or they can be made by the fabricator in the back. You make your own web slingers. Upgrade them if you want. If you get stuck or otherwise need a hand, I'll jump in, but otherwise stay out of it. Tony'd get to see what the kid could do with access to the good stuff. If he absolutely couldn't handle not tinkering with the things, he'd join Peter. But depending on just how good the kid was, well, see, Jarvis had done some poking around after Peter's first appearance at the tower. It hadn't taken him long to discover the financial straits May Parker was currently in. Tony had plans to fix that, but he was well aware of the fact that people like May and Peter tended to have issues with so-called charity. So Tony came up with some ways to work around that. Lots of different ways. Most of which, admittedly, had gotten scrapped pretty quickly. But a few were looking promising. May, for instance, was showing signs of being a mother hen sort if her setting up shop in the kitchen to cook for everyone was any indication. Tony had zero compunctions with paying her to be a full-time cook for them if it turned out that she really enjoyed that sort of thing. Yes, Sparky had started cooking for them in the last week, but she wouldn't necessarily always be available to or even want to. Having a trustworthy cook on hand, especially when they were fresh from avenging and way too tired and or hurt to cook for themselves and didn't want to order in, would be awesome. Another person willing to fuss over the people that needed it would also never be turned down, even if Tony couldn't exactly find a way to pay her for that part of it. Likewise, if Peter proved to be any kind of promising in the tech building, or even general science departments, Tony could put him in one of the paid internship slots SI kept open for promising kids between the ages of 16 and 18. Both options, and several others if those two ideas didn't pan out, would give the Parkers the money they needed to live on without being blatantly charity, which would give Tony and the others the time they needed to try to convince the pair to move into the tower proper. Granted, with his full-body suit, it would take people a lot longer to figure out who Peter was, but eventually they would. And at that point, the people Peter cared about would become potential targets. Since May seemed to be about the only one Peter was attached to, well, that made getting her somewhere she'd be safe a top priority. Tony's declaration got him a huge, somewhat odd grin from Peter, and another somewhat breathy, "Really? Really?" That made it difficult for Tony to keep a straight face. "Yes, really," Tony told him. That got him an even bigger grin before Peter all but raced towards the bins on the walls to get stuff to make new web-slingers with.